This session, and I want to make clear that I'm not Crispin Wright, and I wouldn't, and I wouldn't have been Crispin Wright even if the name Crispin Wright had been grounded in me. We are here to talk about we are here to talk about externalism, and we are of course blessed with having three of the most important people in the history of externalism here to talk to us about it. Tyler's going to speak first, followed by Saul, and then followed by Hilary, and we're going to try and keep it relatively brief, and we hope to be able to open it up for general discussion within an hour or so. Tyler, please.
As far as I know, the term externalism is not used by any of the philosophers on this panel to describe his own views. And when I use the term in this talk, it's always enclosed both in normal quotes and in shudder or scare quotes. I won't pronounce them, however. The popularity of the term has, I think, been inversely proportional to its clarity. Like the term naturalism, externalism warmly welcomes a running together of different doctrines, perhaps in the interest of a felt solidarity among those in need of asserting allegiance to a cause. Much of the problem lies in unclarity about what is external to what. Some answers to such a question use terms like meaning, proposition, and content, whose uses vary widely among individual philosophers. I want to make a few remarks about important differences among views that have been labeled externalist. One family of views, often termed externalist, concerns language. It's trivial that many entities that are in fact objects of linguistic reference are external to, that is, independent for their nature and existence of, language. It is not trivial that some factors constitutively determining the objects for linguistic terms, the objects of reference in linguistic terms are irreducibly external to, that is, independent of, idiolects, dialects, and communal languages. Such factors include causal chains, contextual parameters, and molecular structures that individuals need not be able to specify. This point was established, I think, by Strawson for demonstrative reference, by Kripke and Donnellan for proper names, and by Kripke and Putnam for natural kind terms. I certainly endorse the point. It marks one sort of view often called externalism. There's a range of importantly different, incompatible views about meaning as distinguished from reference that are called externalist views. There is the view of Soames and Salmon that the meaning, or the specifically semantical contribution, of a name is exhausted by its referent. No one on this panel is committed to this position. There is the less committal, but still Millian view that elements of linguistic meaning or linguistic propositional content include objects of reference in the physical environment. Hilary accepted such a view in the 1970s, and Saul has shown at least some sympathy for it. I'm non-committal, shading toward the doubtful. I think that the notion of meaning has a root conceptual connection to the notion of understanding. I think that the direct connection between understanding and physical objects has never been made satisfactorily clear. I think that understanding is always perspectival. The idea of understanding or indeed perceiving an object, even as a component of meaning, neat, is, I think, of doubtful coherence. At least it needs more explanation than I've seen. It does not help to add the negative point that for externalists, meaning is not in the head. Insofar as meaning is shareable, those who are labeled internalists can and should say that meaning is not in the head. Meaning is, I think, an abstraction, hence not anywhere. So I'm doubtful that there is a clear and acceptable notion of externality, according to which it is true, interesting, and distinctive to claim that components of meaning are external to language, the individual, or whatnot. But such a claim is commonly associated with the term semantic externalism. I think that the term is so associated with unclarity and dispute that these issues, on these issues, that it's better to drop it. In any case, I think that the power and interest of the arguments regarding linguistic reference that were given by Donlan, Kripke, and Putnam transcend technical issues about exactly how to regard meaning or linguistically expressed propositions, say singular propositions. To return to something I said earlier, the constitutive determiners of reference are partly independent of individuals' idiolects and communal languages. And insofar as meaning differs when reference does, the constitutive determiners of meaning are also partly independent. Perhaps here we have a shared view extensionally coincident with what is popularly understood as externalism about language. Let's turn from language to mind. In my view, the positive results on linguistic reference are ultimately founded on a broader set of phenomena regarding mind. And the relevant independence of the determiners of linguistic meaning and reference is ultimately to be understood in terms of independence of individuals' psychologies. The term externalism is, if anything, less well anchored with respect to mind than it is with respect to language. Many associate the term with the view that representational mental content, or even worse, mental states and events, are somehow in the wider environment beyond the individual. Although such fringe views haunt the landscape, no major figure that I know of holds any such view, but still it's popularly associated with externalism, the term. Some of the followers of Kripke, though not Kripke himself, maintain that whereas linguistic meaning includes or is exhausted by objects in the environment, representational mental content is always purely descriptive. Proponents of this view are often counted externalists, although their position is internalist on the most elementary aspect, that is, reference, of the most fundamental matter, that is, thought. I'm leaving perception aside just for a few moments here. The original arguments regarding linguistic reference can be trivially adapted to show that reference in thought cannot be fixed by description or descriptive capacities of individuals or even by whole communities. So putting the description in the mind, I don't think helps one bit, and I'm sure that Saul and Hilary would have seen that, immediately. I'm simply not generous enough to share an unqualified label externalist with such philosophers. The view about mind that I provided a series of arguments for beginning in the late 1970s, and which I call anti-individualism, is that the constitutive determiners of the natures of many mental states include relations between the individual in those mental states and elements in the wider physical and social environments. This is emphatically not primarily a view about representational content, but about mental states and events. It is about what representational content mental states or events constitutively have and can have. The view is also not that the representational content is external to the individual. Again, I think of the content as abstract and not anywhere. Moreover, thinkings of the content are always in the individual's mind or head. Thus, externality to the individual concerns the constitutive determiners of the mental states, representational content, and ultimately the nature of the mental state or event itself, not the content itself, and not the mental states or events themselves. The key point is that the constitutive determiners need not be part of or immediately accessible to the individual's psychology. In this sense, elements beyond the individual are partly constitutive determiners of the individual's psychology. This view is not a trivial corollary of the work on linguistic reference. Putnam's work in The Meaning of Meaning, 1975, was at best ambivalent with respect to anti-individualism. But he came, I think, to endorse it fully. I think that it is the doctrine that underlies and helps explain the views about linguistic reference that I characterized some paragraphs back. That is, I think anti-individualism is more fundamental than the views about linguistic reference that are often called semantic externalism. Language is an expression of mind. Externalism about language should be firmly distinguished from externalism about mind, and externalism about constitutive determiners should be sharply distinguished from externalism about the nature of meaning, representational content, and reference. Even once such parameters are set, what externality precisely consists in is in many instances in need of clarification. I think that this label has encouraged sloppy thinking. Although proposals for linguistic reform are rarely heeded in philosophy as anywhere else, I believe it would serve philosophy either to drop the term externalism altogether or always to qualify it so that the relata that are external to one another are clearly specified and the particular relation of externality is clarified. Such usage would be less snappy, but shorthand has rarely served philosophical reflection. Let me turn to a more broad-based observation about the currents in philosophy that I've been discussing. In retrospect, looking back on the momentous events of the 60s and 70s, I'm struck by the relatively compartmentalized focus on language. I was a part of this too. I came a little later, but I count myself in this, my early self at least, in the criticism I'm about to launch here. I'm struck by the relatively compartmentalized focus on language that marked the beginnings of this movement. The first half of the 20th century had focused on perception almost as much as language. With the demise of sense data views at mid-century, interest in perception dropped precipitously. So the initial work on linguistic reference was almost completely divorced from any discussion of perception. Strawson was a partial exception to this remark. His work on demonstrative reference in the 1950s was linked to powerful points about the perception of duplicate scenes. He noted that a perception of a scene that is indiscernible from a perception that would be obtained from a similar scene that occurs elsewhere in the universe would nevertheless be a perception of and only of the scene that it was causally occasioned by. Here, perceptual reference depends on causal relations to a scene and cannot be determined by discriminations available to the individual. In my view, Strawson failed to exploit this insight, at least to my satisfaction, because of his descriptivist leanings with respect to names and his insistence on criteria for the application of general terms. Putnam stood out for his development of linguistic theory for scientific as well as ordinary language, and for his criticism of requirements of criteria. He's also special, I think, for bringing empirical work into philosophy and many other areas. But in the early phases of the work on linguistic reference, no one, I think, besides Strawson, thought hard about perception. Such was the tendency to reflect on language as an autonomous or nearly autonomous phenomenon. Although this focus on language reaped obvious rewards, I think that it carried serious drawbacks. Sometimes perception was, and still is, I've heard it at this conference, regarded as dependent on language for making reference to entities, or dependent on language for categorizing entities under general types. Both ideas are completely out of step with what is known from science. More broadly, if a reasonable conception of perception had been central to these early discussions, the discoveries regarding linguistic reference and mental states might have come more easily. It would have taken a little less brilliance, and in fact, they did take. The discoveries about language would have been made in a broader and more natural setting, and deeper understanding of the origins of reference would have been attained. For example, the Kripke-Donlan points about reference of names have obvious analogs for perception. An object can be seen even though the perceiver could not perceptually distinguish the object, given the perceiver's looking angle and background knowledge, from the look-alike that might have been substituted for the object. This point is analogous to the point that a language speaker can refer to an object with a name, even though the perceiver cannot distinguish the name's bearer from other entities except by use of the name. Perceptual reference is not carried out purely by perceptual attributives or perceptual categories in the perceiver's or perceptual system's repertory, just as singular reference in language is not carried out purely by descriptive resources in the speaker's repertory. Similarly, perceptual reference is compatible with being perceptually wrong about most of the salient features of the perceived object. The color, shape, sortal type, and position of an object can be misperceived all at once, even as the object is perceived. Here we have a clear analog of a standard and, I think, deep point made about the use of names, natural kind terms, and so on. An individual can succeed in referring to the bearer of a name or the referent of a natural kind term, even though most of the individual's associated descriptions are false of the referent. What was unfortunate about, in my view, about the narrow focus on language is not just a failure to exploit analogies between perceptual reference and linguistic reference. There was a failure to follow reference back to its roots. I think actually this bears on the issue about disquotation that was discussed in the last paragraph. I think if one thought of reference in the context of perceptual reference, the disquotational view would seem less attractive, but this is something perhaps we can discuss. In many paradigmatic cases, the association of a name with its bearer or of a natural kind term with a relevant kind depends ultimately on perception. Elementary linguistic reference is, I think, to a large extent grounded in perception. There are forms of reference that are not obviously empirical, reference with numerals, for example. And there are empirical mechanisms beyond perception, chains of communication, introduction of kind terms through hypothesis or theory, and so on. But obviously the empirical roots of these more complex mechanisms, at least for empirical reference, lie in perception. Even in my own work on mind, I did not center on perception until the early and mid-1980s, after I'd studied David Marr's Psychology of Vision in classes at MIT. Putnam does give serious attention to perception in 1994 Dewey lectures, perhaps earlier. In my view, however, these lectures do not make sufficient use of the science of visual psychology, an area of psychology, perhaps almost the only area, that had matured well before then into a mathematically rigorous science. A lot is actually known about visual perception. In any case, I think that a full conception of objective representation must develop accounts of mechanisms for linguistic reference in the light of scientifically informed accounts or a account of perception. I hesitate to say this, but I'm gonna. I found it striking that in yesterday's roundtable on perception, there was not a single serious mention, much less extended discussion, of the considerable body of knowledge in the science of perception, particularly visual perception. Anti-individualism applies to perceptual states. Most of the anti-individualist elements in thought and in language must be understood as grounded in antecedent perceptual representation. I hope to say more in this vein in future work. I turn now to an appreciation of Hilary's contributions beyond what I've already given out, and some questions about them. I think of Hilary's work on reference, which really goes back to It Ain't Necessarily So, 1962, as brilliantly imaginative. The work is carried out with a nuance, depth, and freedom that make it entirely admirable. I think that it will prove to be one of his lasting contributions to philosophy. I'd like to ask two questions about middle-level components of this work. One is about stereotypes. Stereotypes were introduced, I think in Is Semantics Possible, 1970, as short dictionary-type explications of a term. These explications were accorded the function of conveying, in short order, an understanding of the term that might get a novice started in applying it to reference with a T. Hilary rightly, I think, found remarkable the power of such short descriptions to teach a language learner a new term. Hilary emphasized that the stereotype need not be true of the entities to which the term applies, as long as it enables users to agree on a use with respect to standard and paradigmatic examples. I regard this notion as an imaginative contribution to our thinking about meaning and reference. It is intriguing, at least to me, in that it does not fit into any of the standard slots in semantical thinking. My question is how Hilary now regards this contribution and whether he foresees ways of developing the notion further. The other question is about twin earth methodology. I owe much to Hilary's introduction of this methodology. I believe that it is an exceptionally imaginative and effective way of discussing examples. It's not the only way to discuss examples, of course. My attitude is not shared even by all who accept the conclusion of arguments that make use of the methodology. There are those who think that such dramatic fiction should play no role in philosophy, that the thought experiments are too strange to carry conviction, and so forth. I'll not engage with wholesale doubts about the methodology. I think that all the points made with the methodology can in principle be made without it. But discovery and imagination are often aided by just such thought experiments. What I want to focus on is a particular aspect of the thought experiments. It was often noted that the twin earth thought experiment that's centered on water describes a situation that is strictly impossible. One simply cannot have a duplicate twin of my body in a world in which there's no water. From the beginning, I believe that all philosophers with judgment, including Hilary, of course, recognized this fact and also recognized that in some sense it did not matter to the point and force of the thought experiment. Even though the thought experiment rests on an impossible state of affairs, it made its point. I have views about why this is so, but I'm interested in Hilary's views. My question is, what function does a twin earth thought experiment have that enables it to make its point, even though it rests on a story that is, strictly speaking, impossible? Thanks.
Saul, would you like to... You should go up to the mic, Saul. Well, you could probably... Yes. Right. Well, you could sit there and, if Tyler's mic is working, just check to see if it's working.
Yeah, I feel terribly separated from the jet lag, and I also think
Is it working?
the atmosphere panel is better if I don't get up, except if I want to write something on the board or something like that. Okay. Microphone isn't working. People are saying the microphone working or not?
This one's working, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay. Gosh. Two things in this format are very much not my usual forte. First thing is talking at a high level of generality at a topic like externalism, and which is very high in the air. And Tyler has done a good job of piecing out different things that it might mean. I will add a couple comments to this. First, it also slides into the view in epistemology about the nature of knowledge, and it's depending on the external world, and maybe our own justifications have very little to do with it, and so on. And that is really quite a separable issue in which I am more in sympathy with the opposition to that than to the externalist side. Okay, all right, now, so that's one unfortunate thing about this title. Now, I will make a remark, if anything gave rise to this title and slogan, it's probably Hilary's drawing the moral, meanings ain't in the head. Now, Tyler is right that, as literally said, this is, I don't know, this might be a criticism of John Stuart Mill or someone, but not even, say, of Frege, who would have endorsed the view, right? However, what is really different from someone like Frege and Hilary's slogan is that, there's an analogy, I guess, in Frege of like a telescope, and each mind gets the objective and abstract concept or Fregean Zin and so on right through a telescope, and then that is what is in the head, or the mind, if one wants to speak in a less materialistic way. Okay, so that is the exact formulation of this, and is surely, in fact, Hilary's intent. Now, having said this, except as in much as specific topics lead to the some things to do to the notion of externalism, I wish to engage in some dialogue with Hilary. There has been little, if anyone, say, closer to my views on this topic, and as Tyler said, some of his earlier papers, right, even anticipate the thing. Some anticipate it, and some actually go off a little bit in a different direction, and seem to me perhaps to be superseded by the later view, but I don't know whether Hilary thinks so. I want to get in some possibilities of dialogue here. Did I say what was not my forte? The first thing is talking about this level of generality. Second is giving short and encapsulated little presentations. Those who have heard me elsewhere know I have a little difficulty with this. I wouldn't mind at all being interrupted or having interchange with Hilary or Tyler or anyone else, but especially Hilary on specific points. And I will go into one of them. One of them was not something that was my intent, but look, of the early papers, it ain't necessarily so has much that is in anticipation of things that I will agree with, though not all of the actual examples about time travel or whatever seem to me to be set up in a way that I would agree. But it also, of course, does not make the distinction, which is important to my work and to Hilary's, between epistemic and objective or counterfactual or metaphysical, or physical for that matter, conceptions of necessity, but just looks like an attack on necessity itself. I was interested, I don't know what Hilary meant by saying the paper on the analytic and synthetic was the first paper he wrote in his own voice. Did you write?
No, you're right. It ain't necessarily so early.
Is earlier?
No, I think the analytic synthetic was written earlier but published later.
Oh, okay.
There were years,
all right.
There were years.
Either way, what do you mean? There are probably some earlier papers. They were written by they were directed by someone else. Or they were not so original. What?
I haven't found my philosophical. Well, I was writing red and green, for example.
Yeah, the red and green paper. Yes,
I don't repudiate that in any way, or the thing is, or the little thing.
No, it was an ingenious little thing. In fact.
Yeah, but I hadn't found what I wanted to do in philosophy.
Yes. Okay. All right.
Test.
Anyway, look, the analytic synthetic paper on the other hand, I actually happen to have, in a seminar, dealt with that in great detail. In fact, it had a striking impression on me as doing a better job than Klein of seeing why his views on this might be important, and might be important for philosophy of language and philosophy of science. On the other hand, in retrospect, it seems to me, though quite brilliantly done, deals with a very based on a very complicated case, really, the kinetic energy case, about which I might have a lot more to say if someone asked. Anyway, look, it seems to me to create, give a lot less evidence for the Kleinian, the importance of Klein's two dogmas for this type of issue than may first appear. And indeed, you see, I take a lot of the ideology of this paper to be superseded by the later work, like in the case of natural kind terms, or say others medical term, you say, right, and so on, other things like that. Jerry Katz, for example, took me to be attacking the analytic synthetic distinction, wrote me a letter, right, late Gerald Katz. And perhaps you, I don't know. But in fact, I think these are cases where what appear to be definitions simply aren't. You know, they aren't definitions, even though you might find them in a dictionary. They're characterizations, perhaps they're stereotypes, so I have some troubles with such a notion. But rather than saying that we must abandon the analytic-synthetic distinction for these things, we should think, you know, that contrary to the Fodor-Katz analytic topology, these just are not analytic and do not give appropriate definitional ideas, and never did and never should have been thought to do so. Now, the case of kinetic energy and all that and the kinds of things Hilary's talking about involves a lot of complications. And
I should mention, I didn't know of it, but there was a physics text for I think high school students introduced when I first came to MIT that I hadn't seen by Taylor, which uses a much simpler example of MV, its definition of momentum as MV, and points out that proves very nicely, using nothing that a high school student wouldn't know, that if you want something that's in the direction of the motion, conserved in billiard ball, a quantity that's conserved in billiard ball collisions, the technical term is elastic collisions,
yes,
in the direction of motion, then
well, actually, it's kinetic energy that has to be conserved in elastic conditions. It doesn't have to be elastic for momentum.
Okay, but anyway.
Yeah, anyway.
Yeah. That MV is the only possible such momentum in classical physics, and that it isn't quite MV in relativistic physics.
In relativistic, you know, Klein wrote a parallel paper, obviously a BBC talk or something like that, which was obviously under your influence, though it doesn't quote you.
He never told me.
And you know, it's in one collection of his papers, Ways of Paradox or something, and he switches the example from kinetic energy to momentum without saying why or anything. He also does it in a way that makes the thing seem silly. Well, physicists thought things don't work out with the old definition of momentum, and then he finds a neat repair, replace m, divide by the square root of 1 minus v squared over c squared. Then things work out fine. So isn't that a good idea? Is he simply playing with words by changing the definition and so on? If you want to know what I think about that, this example is in both cases very complicated. You know, look, okay, all right, this will take a while, but you in your paper on this, well, I have a lot of things to say, but you in your paper talk about the old disputes, you know, which is the quantity of motion, mv or 1/2 mv squared. Yeah. And then they thought, okay, there are two different concepts, momentum and kinetic energy. But it was a matter of dispute. See, now, in one way of looking at the matter is that in, rather than saying that anything has been changed, this particular matter, I don't know if you can write on this.
Is this one?
Look, the modern theory, at least in space-time form, resolves the dispute by a synthesis. Look, this is a 4-vector. S is the position in space-time with respect. This thing is with respect to the proper time of the moving object. The first three components of this correspond to old-fashioned momentum right? The fourth to energy, including the famous rest energy, discovered by Einstein, back that out to the field kinetic energy, right? In that sense, the answer could be everyone was right, you see. And here is the unified theory, rather than making a change, just putting it in terms of these different concepts. But even if you look at it the old Einsteinian way, well, without space-time, there is something I would prefer to say about this info point where we can, perhaps I should not get into this too much now, and go on. Now, but I do think that this case and this type of evidence gives less to be said in favor. It will get rid of a crude view, but it gives less in favor of going saying we shouldn't use the analytic synthetic distinction that appears. I also think your paper actually invokes the analytic synthetic distinction the way it's formed, right? Okay, right now. But look, now, in the later and parallel stuff to me, in the famous paper, The Meaning of Meaning, one thing which is externalist is, and which I have questioned and thought is more complicated elsewhere, is the view of the linguistic division of labor, and have talked about this before in one paper. I should say the following. To distinguish between, say, gold and fool's gold, the experts, chemists, toolers, and so on, have no linguistic power. They simply are better at doing this than the rest of us, but they legislate nothing. Say, right, okay. Now, this is important because some people have said that maybe the situation isn't so much different except that the whole community is all working together. Now, in some other cases where the scientists have actually invented the object, either chemical compound, an artifact, or something, they may have linguistic powers modulo the fact that that perhaps they can be somewhat mistaken about their own inventions and theories, and
it turns out they can deplanetize.
They didn't all hear that.
It turns out they can deplanetize. They deplanetize Pluto.
Yes. Okay. So now, and of course, a generation of writings about the number of planets equals 9 and its data has hit the dust.
We're moving in ominously in the direction of Hegel's 7.
Yeah. Yeah. Did Hegel really say that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I can prove it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think in Galileo's time there were people who thought there were proofs that there would be only 7 planets. I mean, okay. So, now, such things, and not an illness, in illness such as arthritis, the medical community probably did not have linguistic powers, even though people may be under the type of error that Tyler is talking about, oh, this is arthritis when it's not in the joints, but the medical community has discovered more about what it is. However, something like, I don't know, which happened to a friend of mine, someone I know anyway, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or something where I don't know even exactly what it is, then the medical community might have more of like linguistic powers. Now, one thing should not be said here. Michael Dummett has emphasized in the case of expert that look, what we should not hold is the view, which he associates with me in particular, that we are responsible to the dead. So we are a whole community of Phrygians, but some of them play special roles in the linguistic labor. That is not true, even in the case where the medical community can legislate a term. If they all get together and are blown up after a medical meeting, some awful person plants a bomb, that is not going to immediately destroy the reference to a given disease. Okay. Now, I will say, and much less so in the case where they do not have the legislative ability. Now, okay. Now I have always been intrigued by Hilary's notion of a stereotype here. You know, in my own book, it just plays the role of how we the common identifying marks by which we, I don't give some special term for this, right, that are popularly thought to identify a kind. And they may not be true of it, and they may be true of other kinds and so on. But I didn't particularly give it any particular semantical role. Hilary is plausible in trying to do this, but of course, the idea that it has a semantical role but may well turn out to be false is always puzzled me as exactly what is meant. Perhaps you can tell me. Suppose one of these popular identifying things is in fact false, right? Okay. Now someone comes and learns the term tiger or whatever it is. See, the plausibility when you say someone who takes a snowball and says that's a tiger, he's obviously a little confused. See, right? It hasn't learned English. Okay. So, but having said that, what is going to be required that someone does know? Not that tigers are like this, because that belief could be false, right? Not that most people think that, because maybe most people have been clued in by now, that it was once thought that. What is the association that is required?
Maybe I can take over for a little and you can...
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, because this is connected with the question of Tyler, so I'll take them together.
Yes.
First of all, I think at least Tyler didn't accuse me of the contrary, but on the idea that... Okay, Tyler raised the question of whether externalism, meanings aren't in the head, and he said, well, meanings aren't objects. I pointed, in the meaning of meaning, I said, I don't think meanings are objects. And I think the question is, what I'm proposing is a theory of what a good normal form description of the meaning of a word is. And secondly, I thought of that as what I call that paper grew out of, or its ancestor is semantics possible, grew out of course in the philosophy of language that I gave at Harvard in some years, quite a few years before. I could find out when by finding out when I gave a seminar that David Kaplan attended in Seattle, but I forgot the year. But basically, it grew, and what I said then, though I don't think it's got into print, was I think of this as a mild rational reconstruction. Nobody's going to make no meaning, or even though it's a normal form that would mean perfectly precise, and there's going to have to be some legislation, and of course it's going to bite. Of course, however you do it, it's going to bite our intuition somewhere. But that's certainly in my mind. So what I propose to do then, to come to Saul's question now, so there's no question of an object being or not being in the head in my mind at any time. But coming to Saul's question now, I was guided, as I think maybe even the shorter paper, Semantics Possible, may have even been a little clearer on this. I was guided by basically what seems to be an empirical observation, that I don't think that we expect a child learning the meaning of the word tiger. Whether the tigers are, well, first, the first box makes the tigers are striped. Now, I think in the cases where the community begins to learn the stereotype is wrong, I would have to legislate and say, well, when it ceases to be even stereotypical, then the meaning has changed. So even
But do you think that's so?
well,
it doesn't strike me. That's a discovery about what tigers are.
yeah, but no. But that means the extension is changed, by no means. But that's somewhat of a bit of legislation. But I do think that.
Excuse me a second.
May I
Because people can't hear. And
Okay.
I think.
Okay, sure.
How do you do this?
Well, I took off.
Actually, usually it's another type.
Oh, it's a tie. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't wear a tie today. You're not allowed to wear a turtleneck.
No?
No. Okay, is that doing? Yeah. What I think is, there are stereotypes that are really treated as things that you're supposed to know. I call them linguistic obligatory. I took this notion from Benjamin Lee Whorf's lectures. He has this notion of linguistic obligation. And my intuition is that it's ultimately linguists will have to decide whether what I said here makes sense or not. But I think there are linguistic obligations to know what the stereotypes are with words that everybody uses. And that the stereotype of a tiger is a striped animal. And a case when we begin to discover, but as I know that decision has some counterintuitive consequences. On the other hand, for me, to say that someone who has no idea what tigers look like has the full normal linguistic commonness with it is also counterintuitive.
Oh, yes, I agree.
Hence, I was looking for some kind of a compromise. And I would ask, by the way, since we have you here, there's a case that I don't know what to do with, raised by Charles Travis, who's here. So I'll see what you think of. He, in a paper I guess he hasn't published yet, he raised the following question. Suppose it turned out, my example of something that is analytic in the analytical side, because you're quite right, I didn't want to throw away the analytic distinction. I wanted to stop philosophers from overblowing it.
Yeah.
And I agree with Point, actually, that to say that all of mathematics is analytic and that somehow explains the nature of mathematical truth was a very unfortunate period.
Yeah, but that's a special, it's not really the theme of your paper.
No, it's not. But it's behind. But this overblowing, a concern with not overblowing what analyticity can do. But Charles raised the following example. Suppose so I took as a clear analytic sentence, vixens are female foxes. So since I closed analytic on a certain elementary form of the so vixens are female is that analytic on my story. And Charles raised the question, okay, suppose we find out that foxes reproduce asexually, but they do have two kinds, and one kind, the cute ones, raise the cubs. So have we discovered that there are no vixens, or have we discovered that vixens aren't female? Well, I have not given him an answer on this.
I am not sure, but I think he's
Yeah.
made a case. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, perhaps this could be an error. Somewhat. Yeah, I have to give it some thought. But if there is a case for this, I mean, the alternative would be to say we found out that there aren't any vixens really.
That would be cats, yeah.
Yeah, right, and so on. Maybe that has some intuitive force, and that what we took to be vixens are just computer foxes or something, right? So I don't know, but it raises a question. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, I do think you're on to something with stereotypes, and there's some real notion of mine called a prejudice, which is involved in connection with something else that has some connection with this, but I don't see exactly what it is, because I find not merely a matter of legislation, but somehow intuitively false that the meaning changes when we make these discoveries, or the original meaning gets lost. See, right? Okay. Okay. Now, I do have a lot more to say about this other analytic synthetic case, but I wanted to look at a paper of yours, which is actually directed against me. Sit right out here.
Lawyer, I want my lawyer. I plead the fifth.
Okay. You want to derive a wedge, but further the best, and so you talk about my views on the relation between conceivability and possibility, as you talk about it, and epistemic. Right?
Yeah.
And, okay. And, well, first the argument is that they're more complicated than appears, and perhaps I am even holding some wild view that it's inconceivable that water isn't H2O, which seems way off. Second, there's something about rigid designation which I want to go to first. Okay. Now, partly this is based on some other lectures of mine, which I feel inadequately explained, actually, but at any rate, try to explain the notion of rigidization using a notion Kripke himself very much dislikes, the notion of sortal identity. Consider such a puzzle as the following. Now, look, sortal identity, as used in the philosophical literature, has a weak form that whenever you talk of identity, you give identity criteria which include placing the object under a sortal, rather than, as you might have the impression from reading Hilary, just stamping my foot and saying I'm against it. I actually tried. I don't know which version you got. Try to give arguments why this technique doesn't work. See, right? But there's a strong form which I associated peculiarly with Peter Keats and a couple people, see, right, and not most people, and certainly not you, but seems to be the notion that you advocate here. That is that A can be the same F as B, but A can fail to be the same G as B.
I like that, yeah.
Okay, all right, that's Keats's view.
Relative identity.
Relative identity.
Well, I should have, I may have miscalled it, yeah.
Yeah, that's not what most people mean by sortal identity. If you favor that, you see, I mean, look, even by a couple of, someone who pretty much agrees with Keats's view, and this other Catholic said he probably really evolved this to explain the Trinity. He certainly does justify the Trinity in that way.
It was the motive, yeah.
Oh, and you think it was the motive? You see, as a religious thing, it seems to me to be a little defective because, on the one hand, just thinking of it in terms of Catholic theology. Now, certainly, Catholic theology isn't like a lot of contemporary Protestant theology and saying these are paradoxes, contradictions, and that's fine. Everything is supposed to be a rational belief. But on the other hand, the Trinity is supposed to be something of a mystery, whereas it would be the merest logical common sense if Geach were right. Okay.
I am not a Roman Catholic. I am a Jew.
But even Catholics, I sort of, most of them have thought that this view of Geach is a little peculiar and special. So
Guilt by association.
if you believe it, that is interesting. I'm very surprised. One example of yours is this. Would this table have been the same thing if one molecule had been missing? And then, of course, there's a puzzle because how much and so on. However, there are a lot of vaguenesses puzzles, so I don't really see why this should be decisive here, right? You know, we can start wishing away the poverty problem by invoking vagueness too. Right? But one might relativize it and say it would not have been the same table. It would have been the same table, but not the same mereological sum of molecules. Well, two things. So I just wasn't raised properly, and I'm not even sure that I know what a mereological sum of molecules is and stuff like that. Say, but assuming that I did, and I can give examples using truly common sense notions. I actually think, well, not only is the Geachian view highly dissonant of our normal concept of identity, as this was a remark I got from the late Tom Tomaszka about this. What can it possibly come from? Why not say that there's a table and it is constituted by these molecules or whatever, right? But it is not identical with it, period. See, right?
Well, it seems to be equally counterintuitive. Maybe.
No, that may be counterintuitive. Wait a minute. Let me finish.
Okay.
If someone wants to talk in Geach's way about a case like this, it's because he has, I mean, this is talked about in the back of his or her mind, the exact thing that is supposed to be repudiated. Hey, but look, there aren't two things with the same constitution. The table is the sum of molecules. But that, of course, is using the notion of absolute identity, which is officially being repudiated. What do you, look, I mean, I could give examples without mereological sums of a similar case.
No. What do you say? I mean, I'm trying to avoid, maybe you have a better way. You know, it's very difficult to be criticized by a genius. It's not. All right. Nah, he's not a genius. Okay. It sounded to me as if your view would commit me to saying that, say this weighs 10 ounces or 12 ounces, let's say, with counting the plastic. I want to avoid having to say there are two 12-ounce objects here, namely a bottle of still water and a mereological sum of molecules.
Well, look, in that case, I don't know whether the mereological sum is round, so I'm not so worried about this, but I do take the intuition. Look, an example of that there's only one thing in my hand, you see, but look, an example of mine else, in one version of those lectures, though, maybe not the one you saw, is a plant may grow. It has a flower on top that it never grows that high, but it's blown away by the wind. It consists wholly of its stem. throughout time. Then it's, according to me, these are still different objects because the stem, but not a plant, grew to its full height before it was destroyed. See, you've been talking a counterfactual thing. Now, the counter-intuition to that is, and those are quite ordinary objects, so we don't have to worry about some fancy thing like mereological sums and so on. Now, what about this? If there's an intuition favoring the opposite view, that they're the same, it has to be, hey, but look, there's only one thing in my hand. Say, right? Well, if I hold it, sorry, right? Okay, but that has, but is Tomashko, right, who is himself Catholic, right, remarked to me, that depends on the very notion of absolute identity is supposed to be being repudiated. I mean, that's to preserve it, you see. So it obviously is not going to be the way out. And I certainly think that you can't have the same F, A is the same F as B, but A is not the same G as B. But I also don't even think that talk about A and B, you first have to give a sortal and say what's the same F, but that's a more complicated notion. Now, look, wow, I don't know how much I want to make this a...
Saul is obviously on a roll here. How are we going to proceed, do you think? Because if an hour's gone, and it might be nice if we could get some...
Sure. In fact, part of the trouble with the rest of the other panel was there was nothing, no one from the outside able to say anything.
Right.
And also maybe Hilary wants to say something else that's not relevant to an interchange with me or Tyler or anyone.
Well, you've got your thing on.
Oh, yeah. Well, I did raise one doubt about metaphysical necessity when it goes beyond physical possibility in this paper. If the paper is water necessarily H2O, I assume that's the paper you have.
Yes, that's one paper I have.
Yeah. There I raised, actually originally pointed out to me by Dick Boyd, which is that we have, I think we share your intuitions. I want to, first of all, let me talk about, answer Tyler's questions, because otherwise they'll never get addressed. But this will come back to this. The question on stereotypes, in a way, has been addressed. The question on Twin Earth water, in one of my papers, I wish I had collected it. I think it's the paper called Meaning Holism, which is a bit of a mistitle because it talks a lot about so-called semantic externalism in the Quine volume in the Library of Living Philosophy. If not there, I don't know where. But I remember I once said, okay, you're worried about this being physically impossible. By the way, Newton's famous whirling bucket experiment, no one can produce a whole universe in which the sole physical object is a spinning bottle.
Well, of course, that's what Mach
but nevertheless, Einstein eventually can see that Mach's way out. This is something I learned from Yamima Van Menachem book, Conventionalism. At first, Einstein thought general relativity showed Mach was right, and then he realized that it didn't satisfy.
Oh, I didn't know you came to realize that.
Good. So, but anyway, the point is that you could make the point very often, a short story or a picture, and as many of you know, I was a mathematician as well as a philosopher. So I got tenure in the Princeton math department, in fact.
I didn't know that.
In my last, and then I immediately resigned and went to MIT, but that wasn't why.
How horrible, because almost no one gets tenure in that math department.
I know. I know. Well,
I mean, I think there have been only a couple of people ever.
I'm now adding that to my CV, by the way, that if I check the year date with Paul.
I mean, people get hired from outside with tenure.
That's right.
Right, yeah.
So anyway, I am a mathematician, but very often, mathematicians do not cross the T's and dot the I's until they publish. In fact, Andrew Wiles' proof of FLT, Fermat's last term, has not done that yet, but lots and lots of top number theorists have read it and say, yes, it's a proof, which it generally is. And given the length of the proof, I don't know if anyone will ever write it out in sort of, nobody will certainly write it out in first order logic or higher order logic or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I don't mind using graphic images. But if you want to eliminate the graphic image, imagine, all right, change my example. These people have perfectly good bodies with water in them and so on. But due to some quirk of evolution or some intervention by Martians or whatever, there is a filter in their heads which keeps alcohol from reaching their brains. Now, in this case, I
talk about that in Ireland.
Oh, no. This is going to get very... Okay. Now, this world, unlike my twin Earth, the water is largely... It has a high percentage of alcohol. So we would call it a cocktail. We would not say it's water simpliciter.
Yeah.
But it tastes to them the way also their taste buds don't detect the taste of alcohol. It tastes to them the way water tastes to us. Notice that in this case, the observable properties of twin Earth water to us are not the same as the observable properties of twin Earth water to the twin Earthers. It's just that to the twin Earthers, there's water tastes exactly the way water tastes to us. And since I said it before, and by even in the one thing that's missed even in the meaning of meaning, although I say it explicitly, is since twin Earth water is supposed to have a different chemical composition than Earth water, it will necessarily enter into some chemical reactions that Earth water does not. It was not supposed to be a mysterious substance which had a different chemical formula than water, but didn't behave exactly like water and all. That's why I said, and I didn't know that at the time, but I now know it also necessarily have a different freezing point and a different boiling point. But I may have known that because I deliberately said it at a time when 1750, I think I chose, when there wasn't a developed chemical theory or very accurate thermometers. So one can easily modify it, and in fact, in a way, the modified version is even better because there's no temptation for us to call twin Earth water water, even though, as far as the, say, linguistic centers of the brain are concerned, or the perceptual centers of the brain are concerned, it affects them the same way. Mm-hmm. So, but it's reasonable to ask how much did your conclusion depend on this extreme science fiction case? But the answer is it doesn't depend very much on it. So, okay, go back to...
well, should we open it to the public now?
Yes, let's open it.
Okay, so it's your turn. Questions, please. Got any questions? Let me, right.
Well,
actually, yes, go for it.
I want to come back to this identity problem. You wrote about the thing in my hand is identical or not if the molecules are changed. A student of mine wrote a thesis to solve radically that problem. Yeah. And the thesis is simple that I have in my hand maybe infinitely many objects, as many objects as different descriptions of what I have in my hand are possible. So this is a very, very against Occam's razor tendency to resolve the problem. But maybe it's the only way really to resolve it. I do not see how the problem, it's already an ancient problem. Caesar's ship was already the same discussion in ancient philosophy. So I wanted to ask all on the panel how they react to such a radical solution, how they would react to a radical solution like this.
Me?
I have no answer.
Yeah.
Well, but you're...
I hope there aren't 1,000 objects in my hand just because of something like that. That's I'm always suspicious of these special philosophers' entities. It's bad enough that I have to worry that what I'm grabbing this object, there is both the plant and its stem in my hand. Well, that much is true, of course, even if the flower existed. But there is some sort of feeling there's only one thing in my hand, but you can't solve that by saying this shows that identity is relative to disorder, because the one thing, intuition itself depends on the very notion that is supposedly being repudiated. See, right? A contradiction, if there is or ever is one. I also regard the Geach view that A can be the same F as B and not the same G is just obviously counterintuitive. It got very elementary logic and everything, but that's something else. I didn't know, Geach has a powerful supporter there that I think most people don't know about. See, right?
Oh dear.
Yeah.
You don't know?
Okay, next question up there. Then Alan, the next, and someone over here up.
Well, thank you. I suppose I ought to say in defense of Geach, just a reminder of the context in which Geach was putting forward those examples. I mean, he had a whole series of examples, if you remember. One are the sort of Heraclitean cases, so same river, different water, and so on. So you've got passages of water.
Well, I have views about all these.
Okay, sure, but let me just set the context for this. So what he was interested in was the possibility of a range of equivalence relations. And it's not going to be clear that, for example, that he's deploying the same equivalence relation across the different examples. So just to take the three classes of cases as I recall them, one was the sort of Heraclitean cases. So we've got same river, different water. One was where you have, say, an office where re-identification of the office survives successive occupants of the office. So, for example, you could imagine as it were, a constitutional arrangement in which the sovereign never dies, but successive people are sovereign. So it's not that you meet a new sovereign, it is the sovereign, but a successive individual. So you've got same sovereign, different human being. And the theological cases, of course, the idea there was not to give an explanation of the doctrine of Trinity, but to show that it wasn't formally, or to seek to show that it wasn't formally contradictory.
Yeah,
so it wasn't meant to be
so easy, you think, right?
Yeah, sure. But I think it's worth sort of setting the context. But the point was, you wanted to deploy against him the idea that he relies upon absolute identity, as it were, that that's standing in the background as something that's held upon.
Yes.
But in the case in question, it may simply be some other equivalence relation, not absolute identity.
Look, I want to say one further thing, one thing in favor of Geach. Look, a more benign way of reading his apparatus is, of course, if you have an equivalence relation and restrict oneself to a family of predicates respecting the equivalence relation, that's one way of getting a theory and interpreting another one without inventing any other types of entities like equivalence classes or what have you. And that remark, I think, is quite logically sound and a good technique. A very surprising thing in Geach to me about this is that he fails. For example, one example he gives is, look, we don't need to take rationals as equivalence classes of ordered pairs of numbers or anything like that. It's just the pairs themselves under one particular identity relation, right? Okay. He gives a number of or at least that mathematical example, and I think other ones. He fails to criticize his hero, Frege, for failing to make the same move. Why don't you criticize Frege, who could have just said that the numbers are the extensions themselves, right? Only counts as the same extension if they're in one-to-one correspondence, right? See, in fact, such a device would be possible as a way of interpreting arithmetic in a set theory or something like that. But he does not do so. And perhaps this is just a case of failing to see something because of hero worship. Right? Yeah.
Okay, Alan, I've got one other person. Anyone else?
Yes. This isn't exactly a question. It's rather something that I would like both Hilary and Saul to comment on. and that is, as you were talking, it occurred to me that there's some sort of connection between what Hilary's calling a stereotype, or I think in other places he calls a context a priori. Am I correct that that's the terminology? No. Okay. I thought that, okay, the person I'm commenting on uses that terminology with reference to you. Okay, but I think that, and something that Saul called a prejudice, I believe.
No, I think there is some relation between the prejudice. Yeah, but most people don't know what that is. But I was thinking that if one wanted to defend it, there must be some relation to what I was calling.
Yes, and I thought it was something like this, and then I was just hoping both of you would comment on that. It seems that when we introduce a name like Tiger, we are, in Saul's terms, I guess, have some semantic prejudice of classifying it as a natural kind because we see a group of animals grazing together, some samplings grazing together, looking phenomenally more or less alike, mating, etc., etc. So we tend to think that this group of animals must form a natural kind, that there may be something to its internal structure that determines all this for the species,
By the way, most people are not familiar with this, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, I think I gave a rough idea of what you would call a semantic prejudice with regard to forming a natural kind.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that this is in the same spirit of what Hilary's calling a stereotype. Forget about context a priori. Okay, a stereotype in that when these various things are just a stereotype, and they are defeasible in that we may discover that there is no natural kind. In fact, that there are no laws that these samplings have in common, and no common underlying structure, etc., etc. In which case, then we may give up either the stereotype or even the view that it forms a natural kind and that there's some underlying structure that makes it what it is, or is an essential property of the kind. Maybe I'll just leave it at that and ask for both of you to comment on that. Okay.
Well, I just say the scenario I had in mind, though, was somewhat different. What I had in mind was the scenario where tigers are a natural kind. I mean, we're going to get, Michael Doe is going to talk about this. I think I tend to agree with Ernst Mayr that the biologists use the term species is the ordinary use of the term species, and it's vague and has to be because of the way the theory of evolution is. But leaving that aside, what I had in mind was a scenario where tigers are definitely a species, but the stripes were painted on. Then we weren't wrong.
Okay. I guess I had in mind more the case that you were both talking about before, that you discover that what you've been calling a tiger turns out to be a snowball.
Oh.
Okay.
That would be rather difficult.
That would, yes, to say the least. But nonetheless, it would certainly not fit our semantic prejudice of being a natural kind. And then at that point, one would just simply say something like, I guess that there are no tigers or something like that, with some sort of optical illusion, what have you, whatever the explanation is. And so stereotypes, I thought, in the extreme case, could be pushed even further to what Saul is calling a semantic prejudice.
Yeah, I would like to ask Saul about something he said once. We had a conversation in Harvard once, and you said something I liked, but it was light, and I don't know whether you would endorse it. I was again considering a kind of Locke claimed, and it interests me, that there is a necessary, a trifling truth even, involving any noun, or at least any noun, empirical noun. And his example was, a hedgehog is not a star. Right? And so I started to think, well, or I changed to, tigers are not glass bottles. Because I thought, well, maybe one could argue the stars are really glowing hedgehogs, right? So I changed to, tigers are not glass bottles. But then I thought of this example from Rogers Albert, and I used in the meaning of meaning. Suppose we found out that pencils were organisms. We looked under the microscope, we discovered the nervous system and so on. Turned out there aren't any pencil factories, contrary to what we all suppose. They reproduce. Okay, so I said, well, suppose it turned out that tigers are the form that glass bottles take when frightened. And his reply, which I liked, but I thought on his modal logic, was, you haven't shown it's conceivable that tigers are glass bottles. You've shown it's conceivable that it could become conceivable.
Yeah, no, this is quoted in the thing. I don't have such a memory of this conversation. And I remember when we were talking about double conceivability. It was
very striking.
It was, the types of things I remember having in mind is stuff like, maybe I'm so in, the Cartesian fantasy that maybe I'm so insane that even simple mathematical propositions I'm getting wrong.
That was a different conversation.
Oh, okay. That's what I remember. I thought double conceivability was being invoked here. We can't really conceive this, but we can imagine that it would be imaginable. I don't remember it in this connection except in as much as you quote it. Look, Roger's certainly in my development about this, and maybe in yours too. So I think the example of lemons might turn out not to be fruits. Also, originally comes from Rogers. See, right? Yeah, some of these things are definitely right. In other cases, probably we have to say, we were wrong, there are no A's. And we're the, there wasn't a Loch Ness Monster, it was just, right, or something like that. But, the Loch Ness Monster is real. However, it's just an ordinary. Right, okay. See, we would incline not to say that, and probably a sharp and clear line about this cannot be drawn, right? But as I was saying in this other case of counterfactuals and possibility, the fact that sharp lines can't be drawn doesn't show that there's no distinction to be made here.
Just as a quick remark, your semantic prejudice that we think of it as a natural time might be a clue as to that of our characterizing, if it turns out to be a snowball, to say, not to say that, we now discover that tigers are snowballs, but rather to say, there are no tigers.
Right, that's right. That's right. Now, much more likely and makes sense is, and what I thought Hilary did have in mind as part of the stereotype turning out to be false, is maybe tigers don't have any stripes at all, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Clever tricksters fooled the original explorers, and we haven't seen so many other ones, and so forth, right? So, and then the story went around. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. I have a somewhat meta-philosophical question. More than one panelist has appealed to the notion of intuition, and I would like to know just what that is an appeal to, and with what authority it is invoked. Thanks.
With panelists have appealed to the notion of intuition, what do we have to say about this, and with what authority do we invoke it? I don't know which panelist you have in mind. Say.
I think both yourself and...
We use it only autobiographically, as in my intuition is. That's a nicer way of saying what I think is. It's not a technical term.
Well, I don't know if it's a technical term. It's quite an ordinary term, but I do not think any philosopher really fails to invoke this. However, what sometimes plays a substitute for intuitions are very high-level philosophical. Prejudice is not in the sense of talking about semantical prejudice, but just a bunch of beliefs. Things have got to turn out this way and fit into some grand picture of my metaphysical or other philosophical version of the world. My own idea of using intuition as a test is that we should be wary of this and try and think in a more commonsensical way when we can. Okay, right.
Oh, yeah. Steve, you get in next.
Yeah, so Saul distinguished semantic externalism and epistemic externalism, acquiesced in the label semantic externalism,
yeah.
And said not sympathetic to epistemic externalism, and Hilary agreed. I believe I've heard, correct me if I'm wrong, Tyler, I believe I've heard you say that you are sympathetic to some versions of or aspects of epistemic externalism, but more importantly for this panel, that you think there are relations between semantic externalism and epistemic externalism. I thought maybe I'd invite you to, maybe the three of you to say something about how you might disagree about that, if you do.
Well, I don't like this term any which way.
Yeah, me too.
But I do think that what is often thought of as epistemic externalism is a silly view, like the view that reliabilism or something like that should replace epistemology or replace normative notions. I don't have any truck with that.
Good.
Good. Okay, so that's what I would. Good.
I do believe that there are types of epistemic warrant that need not be accessible to the warranted individual, and this is a kind of parallel to the other case, and I think there's an argument sketched to the effect there better be some such warranted notion having to do with the relationship between warrant and truth and the independence of truth from minds. That's the direction of the sketch. So I think at bottom there's got to be a notion of warrant that is not purely internal, but I'm certainly no skeptic of the ordinary notion of justification by reasons. Reasoning and logic and mathematics is a rather pure case of what epistemic internalists want to cite as and I think the mix between internalist considerations and external ones, externalist ones so-called, need to be explored more. I mean, I think they're independent projects. John McDowell has an internalist project, which I think has some interest. I think it's very important, though, on the other hand, not to forget that certain types of, especially relatively primitive, I think knowledge, certainly warranted belief, can't be brought under this rubric.
I don't think I have any quarrels.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the extreme view, reliabilism and all that, has been very influential and popular nowadays, right? Yeah. It would, of course, get us out of our Cartesian problems and so on, right? So,
could be called what me worry epistemology.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
I think I'm
you have it.
It's on. I think I'm coming back to Tyler's question about thought experiments. We know that one can say that we discovered there are no witches, and we have, I think, no trouble explaining why we can understand that statement, even though there are no witches. But when we do these thought experiments where tigers turn out to be snowballs, I have trouble understanding there are no tigers when there never were any tigers, and well, I just can't get my mind around the thought experiment, and so I fail to see how one would understand there are no tigers. It seems to me different from there are no witches, but maybe you can enlighten me that it isn't.
Well, I wasn't sure what this, and I mean, unless it's like the Rogers-Overton scenario, that is, say, snowballs turn out to be organisms. You know, I mean, you have to say, if it's going to be even an intelligible, what I call the kind of partial intelligibility that you get in a fairy tale about the mice turning into coachmen and the pumpkin turning into a carriage. I mean, it's part of the game of this being just entertainment, that you don't ask questions like, but surely the carriage has a lot more mass than that pumpkin, and the tiger and the coachman is much bigger than the mice, and you know, and how do you distinguish that from a case where the mice are annihilated and replaced by coachmen, etc. And so a lot, and maybe these stories couldn't even be completely spelled out, right? And that is, there are, you know, very often, in philosophy, very often what I want to say, that certain scenarios that philosophers think are clearly possible, is maybe, you know, maybe you'd have to devote hire 1,000 science fiction writers and maybe scientific advisors to help the scientific writers. And maybe we spend a lot of money, we could spell out some of these scenarios so that they would actually represent what we have to concede are possibilities. But I think very often the right response to a philosophical thought experiment is the situation is just so underdescribed that short of knowing which way it would be filled out, I can't say what I would say or what we ought to say. I would like to put a question to Tyler, though, who's been sitting here getting off scot-free. I mean, but I didn't understand, you know, what the phrase "the mental states themselves" when you were talking about externalism. Well, I was speaking of the great paper "Individualism and the Mental," which I taught not this last January, but a year ago, January, and which is one point which is not made explicitly there, but all the materials for it are made. You know, if someone tries to get out of your arthritis experiment, thought experiment, by saying, well, the speaker just has a confused concept of arthritis, the point is that in the other world, he has a perfectly good concept of arthritis. So then it now turns out that whether your state of mind is confused or not is partly externally determined. Yeah, I mean, really, yeah.
Maybe that has to be true.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah. I think of mental states as, to borrow an expression of Gareth Evans, as world-involving abilities, or exercises of world-involving abilities. I would say they're in the head or not in the head. Seems to me odd.
Well, I think the determiners are world-involving, but I don't see any basis in my arguments for putting them anywhere else than where they've always been, either in the head if you're a materialist or somewhere in the mind if you're not. I think thinking of them as sort of spread out in the world is inviting mystery mongering or a kind of explanation that is not obviously needed.
Wait, only if you think of abilities as having a spatial extent, or exercise. And the problem with saying they're in the head for me is I don't think they're scientific objects in the head.
I tend to agree with you there. I also tend to agree with the remark about these abilities and states not having extent. I'm a kind of relaxed default dualist about it. I don't see any clear sense in which they're physical or need to be physical in order for psychological explanation to be carried out. But if science can sort of show that there are types that they're identical with or tokens that they're identical with, fine. That's okay. I doubt it will.
No, I don't think Davidson has proofs of anything.
No.
But I think Davidsonian considerations, you know, and that fact that interpretation is so heavily involved in deciding, say, whether someone believes that there are a lot of churches in Vienna, right? I see no reason to think that it has to be the same computational state, let alone the same neural state, or the same knowledge base. And the language might be different, its grammar might be different. The assumption of a functional isomorphism seems extremely unlikely. it's again one of those possibilities that would have to be spelled out, I think.
I thought I'd follow up on something that Tyler said in his talk. Tyler, you rightly emphasized the externalism about perception, and it's nice to point out how actually that was sort of overlooked for a long time. It's interesting, though, to see how much more radical externalism is when we're talking of the semantics of language, or for that matter, concepts. It's much more radical because of what Saul calls reference borrowing and what Hilary calls the social division of labor. So the content of your mind... by the way, Saul calls reference borrowing, but later people started calling deference. But actually, reference borrowing seems to me to be a better term. It's more radical because, of course, in the case of perception, sure, the content and also the reference is determined by something outside, but, of course, it's determined by something outside that, as it were, you're immediately interacting with. Whereas if you take seriously reference borrowing and social division of labor, then you've got you're referring to something which is very, very distant, could be very, very distant from you.
I don't think that this has to be so. In fact, I think it's not really so. It seems to me most of our simple perceptual categories are determined through things that happened to our ancestors. These are, roughly speaking, innate. And you can bring up a baby or a frog and never let it see any of the things that its content is determined by, cause the inputs and the relevant perceptual kinds will be produced. And I think it depends on relations to things that happened long ago. I mean,
but if I'm
let me just repeat this because I think it's really important. The study of the infant's perceptual system will be the same, and the same perceptual categories will be attributed to the infant, whether the human infant, let's say, is brought up artificially through being given flashes that mimic normal objects, colors, and so forth, or whether it has a normal life. I mean, so